Well, welcome. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming here tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm Deborah Schwartz. I'm with the Mill Valley Historical Society. I'm co-in charge of the First Wednesday Speaker Series, as we're having tonight, and also co-in charge of the Oral History Program. Tonight, we are fortunate to have with us tonight Leal. He is the chief historian for the Jack London State Historic Park in lovely Glen Ellen in the Valley of the Moon. Who has gone to the Jack London State Historic? Could there be a lovelier historic park? I don't know. I have been hiking and hiking and hiking there lately. I just can't get enough, which is why I'm so pleased to have Lou with us here tonight. I asked Lou when we spoke a couple days ago to tell me a little bit about himself because he'll be talking about Jack London tonight. And he told me a wonderful story about the first time he came to the park, and I'd like to share it with you. Having read Jack London as a young boy, the interest in this particular writer had already started. And when Lou was just 18 years old, Lou, was it? You came to Sonoma with your friend to visit your friend's uncle. Right. And they decided to go check out the property, the ranch that Jack London had lived in and the beautiful, what is now the park. And so the boys got a ride over there and they were wandering around until they got to an imposing stone structure, which was next to the vineyard. And the building appeared to be abandoned. They had no idea what the building was, but felt that it had to have some relationship to Jack London. So they took some pictures. But Lou felt guilty about being on the property, and he didn't want to linger. So the boys, they took off. Many years later, when Lou retired from the Mount Diablo School District, he searched both Napa and Sonoma to find some small property where he could grow his own grapes, wine grapes. And Sonoma felt more like home, so he bought a house there with an acre of land. About a year after moving in, Lou took the opportunity to become a docent at Jack London Historic Park and reconnect with the writer that he had admired since his youth. After being docent for a while, he went on a hike on Sugarloaf Ridge State Park, and by chance, he met Milo Shepherd on the hike. Now, as they walked together, Lou learned that Milo was
we should say who Milo.
Here it is.
Oh, it is? Okay.
He is the
I forgot what I told her.
He is the grandnephew of Jack London. His father, whose mother was Jack London's stepsister Eliza, had inherited Jack London Ranch from Jack's widow, Charmian London, in 1955. So then Milo and Lou became friends, and in fact, Milo became a mentor to Lou in all things related to the Jack London history. One day, Lou dared to tell Milo that he had trespassed on the property when he was a young man many years ago. Milo's response was easy. Well, you weren't the only one. And now for 21 years, Lou has continued to walk the property, not as trespasser, but keeper of the flame of all that Milo passed on to him and preservationists of Jack London's legacy. Lou conducts tours at Jack London Cottage, Ranch, and Wolf House for visiting adults and school groups. He has worked at developing indoor and outdoor interpretive displays, including the Snark exhibit. Lou also works as docent training, docent enrichment, and serves on the volunteer council after having served for 13 years on the executive board of the Valley of the Moon Natural History Association, the organization currently operating the park. And honestly, I have never seen such a happy volunteer force. Whether they're on foot or a horse or in the cottage, smiles, friendly, so nice. Lou has published several papers and articles about Jack London's life, and his focus has always been in developing an accurate picture of Jack London that is based on honest research. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Leal.
Well, thank you. It seems like the 21 years have gone very quickly. I've done a lot of work there, and I continue to enjoy being at that park, and I think I always will. I hope you go back soon if you've been there, and those who haven't, come on over. It's a wonderful experience, especially if you love history. Okay, so we're going to talk about Jack London history, and the thing to understand most about Jack London is that we have to think of him as a human being and not just as a writer or an adventure storyteller or whichever way he generally is depicted. We have to think of him as a human being with human feelings, and we have to think about his maturing and having the same problems as a young person as anybody else does. Those problems have to do with feeling that you have to find a way to fit in to the society around you. They have to do with understanding that you're a sexual being and that you're interested in women, according to Jack London. He had a hard time at the beginning. He had a rough beginning, thinking himself always as a poor, struggling kid who had to work very hard all the time. So he had to go through life, experiencing life, and making mistakes, hopefully learning from those mistakes. So anyway, that's the Jack London that I've studied. Aside from the genius of his short story writing, he was a man who evolved. If you read enough about Jack London, you'll read negative things about Jack London. People have made it a point to find a part of Jack London's life where we can depict him in a negative light, and it's easy to do because he did make a lot of mistakes in his life, and he did start off stumbling. And the most amazing thing about Jack London, in my opinion, is that he wound up a very, very human being. That's the important thing. Okay, so let's get started. I think I better get rid of this. And it might last longer if I sit, I think. Flora Wellman, Jack London's mother, born August 17, 1843, was the daughter of Marshall Daniel Wellman, known as the Wheat King of Ohio, Massillon, Ohio. Flora was age 3 when her mother died. She contracted typhoid fever at age 13, ran away at age 16 to live with her sister for a few years, and left Ohio after the Civil War and went to Seattle at age 30 to board with the former mayor of Springfield. It was in that home that this was in Seattle, it was in that home that she met a man named William Cheney, an astrologer, 22 years older than her. She and Cheney separately went to San Francisco in 1874. Flora lived with Cheney for about a year, assisting him with lectures until she became pregnant. Cheney did not want the baby, so he left Flora. Flora said that she became so despondent that she didn't want to live anymore. She put a pistol to her head, she said, and pulled the trigger. She suffered a wound to the side of her head, but no penetration into her skull. Newspapers carried the account of the incident, thus making it impossible for Cheney to stay in town because it wasn't safe for him. Cheney offered a different account of the suicide many years later, saying that a deputy reported no one in the neighborhood heard shots and that the supposed suicide pistol smelled of oil and not of smoke. Flora recovered from her extreme emotional trauma and went on to have the baby. You are hearing me okay way in the back? She named the boy John Griffith Cheney on the birth certificate. John London was a man that Flora met, thankfully. Flora was not able to nurse, so a wet nurse, Virginia Prentice, who had just lost her baby, was able to provide the precious milk. Jack lived in the Prentice household until he could be weaned. Virginia's husband, Alonzo, knew a fellow carpenter named John London. This connection is how Flora met and married John and gave little Jack his new last name, London. John London had admired a shirt that Alonzo was wearing and asked how he could get one for himself. Flora had made the shirt, so John, getting a shirt is how he met Flora. When Virginia Prentice was wet nurse for Jack, she called him Jackie. When Virginia, which is probably the reason Jack London took on the name Jack. As Jack grew up, the Prentices were part of his family. John London's daughters, Eliza and Ida, were added to the family soon after the marriage. In 1879, Jack and Eliza almost died during a diphtheria epidemic. Eliza remembered many years later hearing Flora ask, quote, "Can the two be buried in the same coffin, doctor, to spare expense?" Unquote. Eliza said this scared her so much that she tried really hard to get better soon. John London refused to accept the doctor's belief that nothing could be done. So he brought in a doctor who was known for having success with diphtheria. The doctor was successful, thus giving the rest of their lives for Jack and Eliza. Otherwise, no Jack London. Now, the many moves of the family. Flora, John, and the three children did not live in one house or apartment for very long. While Jack grew up, thus creating a feeling of instability in Jack's mind. After moving from San Francisco to Oakland when Jack was age 3, there followed moves to Alameda, San Mateo County, and Livermore to return to Oakland when Jack was 10 years old. This is Jack at 10 years of age. Then there were 10 more moves until Jack got married at age 24. So you can see that that life was not very settled. Jack always looked on this childhood as one of struggle, and he dreamed of a better life. By age 5, his mother had taught him to read very well, and so he was reading books way beyond any 5-year-old's level. And he would pick up books wherever he found them. He found a lot of books discarded, so he would pick anything up that he could find. He happened to pick up a book called Signa by Ueda, which is I guess a 2-volume novel about an Italian boy growing up in hardship and struggling through life, and finally becoming a violinist and a composer. This really turned Jack London on. This is what he wanted to do. He wanted to be somebody. Now, he had some early adventures. It was at age 15 that Jack became an oyster pirate to make quick money by robbing the oyster beds in San Francisco Bay. He also joined the other oyster pirates in drinking, heavy drinking. Jack quickly decided that raiding the oyster beds could get him killed, as it had with some of the boys that he knew. He quit the pirating and for a short time worked with a fish patrol, catching people who broke fishing laws on San Francisco Bay. Now he was on the other side. However, there is no account that he ever arrested any oyster pirate. Now, jumping up ahead to from 15 to 18, in 1894, that was a year of severe economic recession. Workers' wages hit new lows and unemployment was way up. Jacob Coxey was a wealthy quarry owner from Massillon, Ohio. That was his mother's birthplace, by coincidence. He tried to organize an army of unemployed workers to protest in Washington, D.C. Jack was working in a jute mill for 10 cents an hour. In San Francisco, Charles Kelly organized an industrial army as a contingent of Coxey's army. Jack and his friend Frank Davis started east, hiding out on freight trains. In extremely cold weather, Frank gave up and Jack continued. That was his strong will to do something all the time. He never gave up on anything except one thing that I'll tell you about towards the end. So Jack kept a journal of his adventures, including begging for meals, being pursued by lawmen, enduring hunger in extreme cold and wet weather. In Hannibal, Missouri, Jack caught up with Kelly's army, but found that they had little or no food. He stayed with them a couple of days, and then he couldn't take it anymore. He deserted and he said, I just could not stand the idea of starving. He continued his freight car journey going on to Chicago, where the post office had several letters waiting for him, including one with 4 greenbacks from his mother, which really helped. In St. Joseph, Michigan, he stayed about a month with his aunt, Mary Everhard, sister of John London, before continuing his journey east. He made it to Niagara Falls, which impressed him so much that he stayed until midnight. Then he slept in a hayfield and started back in the morning to see the falls once more before he took off again. It didn't work out too well because a policeman caught up with him and asked to see his money. Jack didn't have any at that point, and so he was arrested for vagrancy. He appeared in court thinking, this is America, all I have to do is speak up and tell them what I'm doing here, everything will be fine. So when he started to get up to do that, the bailiff pushed him back down in his chair, and the judge said 30 days. Well, if you can imagine, all the jails were full of unemployed men. Consequently, the only place to put Jack London was in the state penitentiary, which they did. So he went to the New York State Penitentiary, and he spent his 30 days there. So Jack served his sentence, but while he was there, he witnessed men being treated, he said, worse than animals. It was a terrible experience for him to see the brutality and the bloodshed that occurred inside that prison. His travels as a hobo and his arrest changed his whole outlook on life. In his essay, How I Became a Socialist, he explains his repulsion of how the social order in the country only favors the very rich. Anyone interested in learning more should read Jack London's book, The Road, for an account of his hobo experiences. I think you'll find it very interesting if you have never read it. It's a fairly short book. Now, jumping up ahead to age 21, I call Klondike Gold. In 1897, a ship docked in San Francisco with some of the men who had struck it rich in the Yukon Territory of Canada. Jack and his sister's husband, James Shepard, caught the gold fever, so Eliza mortgaged her home to outfit the pair with the extensive amount of equipment. The food, the provisions required by the Canadian government to enter the gold country, because they wouldn't be allowed to go in there if they didn't have what was required. So once there, it took only 2 days of packing loads to convince shepherd, stepsister Eliza's husband, that his body could not take it. So he left, and he came back home. Jack continued, but he joined 3 other men that he had met. And so they could work together, and they could help each other that way. So this is a picture of one of the entries into getting towards the gold country. But when you go over this pass, you still have 400 miles to go. So you have to be pretty sturdy in order to exist in those conditions, and also be able to pack all the stuff you brought in, and you have to take it from one spot to another, go back and get another load, take it, go back and get another load, and keep going from place to place until you get your stuff to the next spot that you're going to be. So this was not an easy task, but Jack London does not give up easily. So they traveled by river, they traveled by boat, but these were not boats that they bought. They had to build them along the way. Not just boats like rowboats, but also they put together big rafts and traveled that way part of the time. Jack had some proficiency in sailing and being in water, so he actually was better equipped than many of the other men, and so he took charge when it came to boat building or anything like that, and also to maneuver through rapids when they encountered rapids. So he not only had to build something, he had to build it strong enough so it would withstand the ferocity of extreme rapids too. So an abandoned cabin on Split Up Island at the mouth of the Stewart River and Henderson Creek was where Jack and his partners, Merritt Sloper, Jim Goodman, and Fred Thompson, set up their home base. The group filed 8 claims and did find some gold, a little bit, but Jack couldn't hold out. He had to come home because he developed a really bad case of scurvy, and he was unable to do anything at that point. He said that he remembers the thing that saved him was being able to get a can of tomatoes from a man who gave them to him, and eating those tomatoes. And he said slowly started to get better. And so he came home, and it was his health that didn't hold up, and it wasn't Jack giving up. He just couldn't take it because of his body. So going into his writing career, we have to go back to age 17. The first early work published was A Typhoon Off the Coast of Japan. It was a work that he entered in an essay contest sponsored by the Morning Call San Francisco newspaper. Jack's essay described his experiences as able-bodied seaman on the Sophia Sutherland hunting seals in the Bering Sea. This is a picture of Jack taken in Yokohama when he was on his way to the Bering Sea where the seals were caught. Jack's essay won first prize. At that time, $25 went a long way. He won first prize of $25. Second place, remember he's 17 years old. Second place went to a Stanford student, and third place went to a UC Berkeley student. Jack at 17 already showed his writing talent and potential. At Oakland High School, the literary magazine Aegis published several of his essays and short stories when Jack had decided to go back to high school, and that was at age 19. By the way, he never finished high school. Upon return from the Klondike, Jack pushed himself to write and succeed. On December 31st, 1898, Jack writes to his friend Ted Applegarth, "I have never been so hard up in my life." Then at the start of 1899, his short story, titled To the Man on Trail, is published in the Overland Monthly magazine, a literary magazine, the first one of San Francisco. The door opens to possible success. Jack had already applied and taken a test to work for the post office. He was offered employment, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. he felt that he was close to achieving something. So he told him, put me down further down the list, and you can call me again. And they said, no, we don't work that way. So 3 more short stories were published by the Overland Monthly, but not much money yet. Then his short story, Odyssey of the North, is published in the Atlantic Monthly magazine. East Coast. This gave him important exposure on the East Coast. With writing at high speed, he pawned his bicycle to buy stamps to submit more and more manuscripts. His first book, The Son of the Wolf, a group of short stories, was published by Houghton Mifflin in April of 1900, when Jack was 25 years old. Now, I don't know how many writers find success at age 25. Most writers never find true success, but Jack had it in him. He was obsessive about observation and about listening to people's lives and about wanting to know what turned them on, what made them happy, what struggles they were going through, what they hoped for in life. This is what Jack was interested in. He was interested basically in humanity. So many other short stories were published by various magazines then. He signed the contract for his first novel, A Daughter of the Snows, with McClure. Jack London was now a successful writer. In 1903, he was about ready to become much more successful. We're going to get back to this part a little bit later. I want to tell you a little bit about what was going on with Jack London's personal life. It was when Jack was 24, he met Anna Strunsky, a Russian immigrant who was 1 year younger than him at a Socialist Labor Party event in San Francisco. It was December of 1899. There was instant attraction for both Jack and Anna. He found her to be intellectual and emotional. She saw him as an incarnation of the Platonic ideal of man, the body of an athlete and the mind of a thinker. Anna had been a Stanford student and was now taking classes at UC Berkeley. Jack offered to be her mentor by helping her get her writing published. Exchange of letters started quickly, and they started meeting regularly, mostly going outdoors for walks and picnics. They enjoyed reading poetry to each other. Jack felt himself to be rather a rough character, so he was trying to be as gentlemanly as possible when he was around Anna. And he felt himself less well-read than she was. After all, she had a degree already, and she was taking more classes at UC Berkeley. Many years later, Anna recalled a day 4 months into their friendship when they walked up a hill near the UC campus. She had a feeling that something sweet and beautiful was about to happen. Jack ran his fingers through her hair. Anna had the feeling that possibly she had been too bold. This was Victorian times, and had been making demands. So she started talking, and she mentioned that she wanted to go back to Russia and share in the revolution. Well, this kind of broke the closeness that they were feeling. So the moment passed where Jack might have proposed marriage. Possibly he felt rejected. Possibly he might have felt that he had no right to prevent Anna from going back to Russia. The moment of indecision where neither declared their love left both of them dissatisfied. Anna would have changed Jack's life. Just think about it. There would have possibly been no trips to Glen Ellen, no purchase of land to develop a beauty ranch. Certain books would have been written differently or never existed. Possibly there never would have been a Snark voyage into the South Pacific. 4 days after the miscommunication between Jack and Anna, you can imagine Jack's state of mind at this point, a young man, inexperienced in many ways. He turned around and he asked his good friend, Bessie Mattern, to marry him. Surprise. And the true reason is very difficult to ascertain. I just count on the fact that he was totally confused, and he needed some sort of verification as a person. And Bessie was such a good friend and so close to him that she was the obvious choice. Not the best way to make a decision on marriage. So, just prior to this, or just at this same time, Nanette Ames, the editor of the Overland Monthly magazine, who was also the niece who had raised Charmian Kittredge, who later became Charmian London, Jack's second wife, but that goes a little further on. She had asked Jack to come over for lunch so she could get her niece and Jack together. Well, Jack sent Netta a letter, Ninetta, they used to call her Netta for short, that he wouldn't be able to come to lunch, saying, well, you know how I do things quickly. Well, I've decided I'm going to get married. That's the way he was operating then. The first marriage, this, by the way, is Anna. This is my favorite picture of Anna. The other ones that have chosen somehow don't seem to reveal the sensitivity that she had. So after the marriage to Bessie, they had a first child, Joan. Anna did not disappear from Jack's life. Here, by the way, is Bessie with the two girls that she had with Jack. Joan is on the left, and Becky's in front. Becky was born when Jack was away in Europe. Anyway, Anna did not disappear. She had Jack continue as her mentor and became a frequent visitor to the London household where she was welcomed and accepted by Bessie. During this period, Jack got the idea of writing the book, The Kempton Wace Letters, with Anna as a co-writer. This book of letters between a pragmatist and a romantic idealist became an enjoyable project for both. Jack even had Anna move into the house with them so they could work faster. Bessie said that Jack and Anna would rise at 4:30 in the morning and disappear into Jack's study for many hours. In the afternoon, Jack and Anna would go out into nature, leaving Bessie home. Anna noticed that Bessie started to be upset. So this shortened the period Anna lived in the house. The feelings of love between Jack and Anna became so strong that Jack actually asked Anna to marry him. He would attend to ending his marriage. Anna impulsively said yes. Anna's love for Jack now kept her in a waiting mode until she learned that Bessie was pregnant again. That ended any hope that she and Jack would ever marry. Now, 1902, see, Becky was born in 1902. I call this year Escape from Marriage. Jack eagerly accepted a commission from the American Press Association to report on the Boer War in South Africa. He needed the money, and he also needed to get away. His assignment was canceled when he arrived in New York City, so he met with his editor, George Brett, at Macmillan to propose that he would instead go to England to live on the East End of London and learn and write about the poorest people in London. His book, The People of the Abyss, was not a financial success. You can imagine recessions and depressions of the time. Who wanted to read about all these poor people who were in such bad shape? So he was writing about that extreme poverty in the East End, which actually mirrored what was happening in places all over the world. On his return from Europe in 1902, Jack was excited over the birth of his second daughter, Becky. He was happy and immersed himself in family life. However, awareness of his dissatisfaction with his marriage started to resurface. By the next year of 1903, he was totally busy in writing and selling books. This was the year that Call of the Wild was published and resulted in a huge bestseller in the US and later in England and other parts of Europe. Jack accepted $2,000 up front without royalties, but never regretted it because Macmillan promoted his writing and helped to make Jack London an internationally famous writer. With money soon coming, Jack bought a sailboat named the Spray and used it to escape from his failing marriage as much as he could. In June, Jack sent Bessie and the girls to vacation at Wake Robin, the resort owned by Nanetta Ames, Charmian's aunt, and the editor for the Overland Monthly, so he could take off on his own on the Spray and hopefully convince one of his women friends to go with him. This never happened due to a wagon accident that sprained his knee and scraped the skin off his arms and legs. Now he was at home. His family was in Glen Ellen. He had his friend, Frank Atherton, help him out and do things for him until he could get mobile again, and he was getting ready to go ahead and go up to Glen Ellen and bite the bullet. At this time, he received a visit from Charmian Kittredge, who showed up. The reason she showed up was that Bessie, Jack's wife, had asked her to pick up certain supplies and take them over and give them to Jack so he could bring them up to Glen Ellen. Well, Jack was really happy to see Charmian. He had had a bad time with his wagon accident, and he started seeing her kind of in a different light now. He started seeing her as another possibility of escape. So he kept talking to her and talked to her for about half an hour. And then finally, something happened to Jack. He looked in Charmian's eyes, and he saw something that he wasn't expecting to see. It was something that brought out extremely strong emotional reactions for Jack. Impulsively, he pulled Charmian towards him and gave her a long, long kiss. It was that kiss that changed the lives for both of them. Now, all of a sudden, Jack found that catalyst that he had never had before to leave his marriage that he wanted to leave for the last 2 years. So that was the beginning of a new life. After that incident, they wrote letters to each other every single day. back in the old days, people wrote to each other all the time. And mail delivery was very good. Well, it still is pretty much. Anyway, he knew what he wanted to do now. He went up to Glen Ellen. He told Bessie he was leaving her, took off back to Oakland, packed up his stuff, rented a flat for him and the family of his friend, Frank Atherton, and they all moved in together. Jack and Charmian kept their relationship out of public eye, of course. In January 1904, Jack was off to Japan as war correspondent for William Randolph Hearst to cover the war between Japan and Russia. This is not a man that sits still for very long. The war was taking place in Korea and Manchuria. While Jack was in Korea, Bessie filed for divorce, naming Anna Strunsky as the correspondent. This was done at the advice of her lawyer. Jack had asked Bessie for a divorce in the past, something that she had refused to do, thinking things would be better for the children if the marriage continued. Bessie already knew that Charmian was the real person, but it was thought that Jack would not follow through on the divorce since Anna's name would be dragged out in public. Somehow, another coincidence, a reporter managed to find divorce papers in Bessie's house that leaked out the story and was published in the press. Now the bargaining chip had disappeared, so Bessie filed for divorce on the grounds of desertion. When Jack came home from Korea, Charmian was not there to meet him. Ninetta had told Charmian to disappear from the area until things had calmed down. She stayed away for 2 months, until through letters from Jack, she sensed that in his desperation of not seeing her, he might do something impulsively, that she might lose him. Jack and Charmian did the best they could in not being seen in public together at this time, after she came back. In a letter to Charmian, Jack admitted that he felt strong love for his daughters upon his return from Korea, and he had this strong urge to stay in the marriage. He had had a happy return to Bessie and daughter Joan. Becky was asleep when he got home, so they all went up to wake her. When she opened her eyes, she said, "My daddy." Bessie informed Jack that these were the first words Becky had ever spoken. Now we go on to the second marriage. Let me describe Charmian before continuing. Charmian was almost the opposite of Bessie in any way you can imagine. Charmian had been raised by her Aunt Ninetta up in the Oakland Hills in a very high upper class style. And she had moved in with Ninetta to take care of her and grew up with her. Ninetta was part of the Bohemian movement in the Bay Area, and she was one of the many believers in free love. So it was not invented by the hippies, and probably not invented by the Bohemians either. In October, oh, by the way, I should say a few other things about Charmian. She was not Victorian either in any way. And she did have a lot of suitors. She was asked to be married several times. She refused every one of them. And also, she more or less believed in free love. That's the way she was brought up. But more than anything, what was important was that she actually became, what they call nowadays a feminist. In other words, she believed in the value of being a woman for being a woman. And she felt that she could do almost anything any man could do, she had her own horse. She rode up in the hills all the time, and she was unlike the other women of the day because she didn't ride side saddle. She rode astride just like a man. That was outrageous back in those days. She even took a skirt and cut it down the middle from the bottom and sewed it together so that she could go astride the horse. This was her way of dealing with it, and in a way, she must have invented something that women wore later. I don't know how much later. I don't know how long that Victorian era stayed on. Anyway, that was Charmian. And also, she had a feeling for adventure. So you can imagine how closely she matched Jack in their feelings, their likes and their dislikes, and their temperaments in having a good time and enjoying life. So in October of 1905, Jack started, let me check my time here. Jack started a lecture tour through the country, being paid $600 a week plus expenses by the Slayton Lyceum Bureau. In November, as his divorce was to become final, he asked Charmian to come to Chicago so they could get married. They married 2 days after the divorce was final, and Jack took a break from his lecture tour, and he and Charmian went off to Jamaica and Cuba to honeymoon. And then on their return, they came back to to the U.S. and Jack continued his lecture tour. Charmian went home to Glen Ellen, to where Nanetta lived, and so this was a year of let's see where I left off here. When he completed the lecture tour, that was finished in February of 1906, coming back to Oakland, he bought a house for his mother, and he reserved a large upstairs room for him and for Charmian whenever they would be in Oakland or going to be in San Francisco. So Jack and Charmian now settled down in Glen Ellen at Wake Robin Lodge, which had been bought just recently, recently in 1903, by Nanetta, Charmian's aunt. This is a picture of Charmian, which was taken before she married Jack, a few years before she married Jack. This is a picture of Wake Robin Lodge with Jack and Charmian. I knew if I turned my head too fast, this thing would come off. Okay, now I'll ask you the important question. Can you still hear me okay back there? Okay? I'll try not to be so animated. So here we are at Wake Robin Lodge. Jack constructed an annex there for he and Charmian to live in. The keel of the Snark was laid, and construction was started on a stone barn. The Snark was the boat that was to take them around the world. There's the construction. It was at Anderson Shipyards at Hunters Point in San Francisco. Less than 2 months after the Londons and everyone else was awakened, less than 2 months later, they were awakened, everyone else in San Francisco area and the Bay Area were awakened by the earthquake. After viewing the near total destruction of Santa Rosa, Jack and Charmian went by ferry to San Francisco, where they walked around interacting with the survivors of the earthquake and the fire that was ensuing. They took many pictures, and Jack got a lot of information from the people that he spoke to and really got a feeling for what it's like for people to lose everything they have in their whole life. He went back home to Glen Ellen. Collier's magazine offered him a commission to write an article about the earthquake, which he did. The Snark construction was delayed considerably, with the costs after the earthquake skyrocketing from an early estimate of $7,000 to over $30,000. The finishing was done in Oakland until the Snark left for the first leg to Hawaii on April 23, 1907. During the voyage, it became quickly apparent that some of the work on the boat had been substandard. There were leaks, metal fittings for the sail ropes broke, the engine failed to work adequately, and the Snark could not be made to heave to in a strong wind. Jack's navigator turned out to be lacking in navigation skills, so Jack had to bring out the books so that two of them could become proficient in navigation while they were sailing. So finally, Hawaii was reached, and the Snark went through over 4 months of repair and getting away, sailing south to the Marquesa Islands in October. And this is possibly Pearl Harbor. That's my best guess. And we went off to the Marquesa Islands. These are Marquesa Islanders who had just finished, they're dancers. They had just finished a performance with the music from Jack London's Victrola. And then from there, they went through all the chains of islands, all the way to the Solomon Islands, closer to Australia. This picture was taken at Pendruffin Copra Plantation on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This was a costume party that the owner of the Copra Plantation put together, where everybody was having a great time and drinking, and the owner of the plantation decided it was some time to get to something stronger, so he brought out hashish and proceeded to demonstrate to use it, and proceeded to amaze him as to how mellow he became, and how astute and how smart he was, and it really made an impression. So Jack immediately said he was going to try it next. So he did. However, his demeanor was not the same as this other guy's. Jack went berserk. He started running around, yelling, screaming, and scaring everybody at the party, scaring them so much, no one else was willing to take hashish after Jack. So there were many adventures along the way, and including cannibals, headhunters, and tropical diseases. The last one's really important. Now, return home. Jack, Charmian, and their manservant, Nakata, returned home in July of 1909 after they had been going all around to places around Australia, and then made their way back to take a steamer across, not back to the U.S., but to Ecuador, so that they could see some of South America, and then make their way north from there, which they did. So it was leisurely coming back. So this allowed Jack and Charmian time for more adventure. They even saw the Grand Canyon on the way home. In 1911, they traveled by wagon pulled by 4 horses on dirt roads from Glen Ellen to Central Oregon and back in 3 months. Another adventure. Preparation included a test run of a few days to see if there might be problems to consider. They first drove to Petaluma on June 2nd and stayed at the American Hotel. Then to Olema on June 4th, and spent the night. On June 5th, they drove to Point Reyes and spent the night. On June 7th, they drove south along the coast to Mill Valley. This was their test run. And this is a picture outside probably their hotel where they stayed in Mill Valley. If someone is here that can recognize it, could you tell us what it is?
That's on Throckmorton by the place. The Mill Valley Library. Right? Over there.
So we're pretty close to the spot.
You're about a block and a half.
Yeah.
That was the library when I was a kid, the 1911. It was just being finished in 1911.
There's the picture, I believe, belongs to the library, but it was more or less on loan from the Shepherd family, the family that inherited Jack London Ranch. And so when I asked to use the picture, they said, well, you have to get permission from the family. And I said, whose name's on it? Well, it was Irving Shepherd. And I said, well, don't worry about it. Irving Shepherd died in 1976, and his son Milo took over, and he died in 2010. And I know both of his sons, and everything will be fine. Here's a picture on the cover of the Rancher magazine. And can you
see entrance to Dow's Stable? That is on Throckmorton, and you see the full curve going around. And then there's another crop of that green, Mill Valley Market. It's not the same one.
Do you have access to the pictures? Well,
I was the one who talked to people.
I see. If you
He
could,
also rode the railroad up Mount Tamalpais and the Huntington Library.
I saw those. Yeah. Huntington Library, by the way, has the largest collection, Jack London collection that there is.
But they are missing the album.
Oh, they're just missing?
Well, there's some indication that they might be library. But this article that they got
Right.
still has the album.
Yeah.
What happened to the album?
Yeah. Could you do me a favor and hang around after I finish? I want to give you contact information because I'd like you to make the description in writing about what's in these two pictures.
Sure.
Good. Thank you. Now, this is a picture en route up to Oregon, and this was probably taken in Crescent City. I'm not sure. But that's the route that they took going up the coast. And I don't think this is in Oregon. You can see, the same four-horse wagon that came to Mill Valley. And in the back seat is Nakata, their manservant. Nakata went everywhere with them. Okay, going on. The trip to Oregon started on June 12th of 1911 and ended on September the 5th. Now I go into the last part, which is the controversies surrounding Jack London. Many writers have chosen to depict Jack London in a sensational tabloid manner. The reader, in many cases, is left to decide what is true and what is speculation. The areas that develop much controversy and disagreement are those concerning Jack London's death, his alcohol consumption, the Wolf House fire, and his relationship with women. Research in this area has been somewhat incomplete, thus resulting in much speculation. Some writers have used London's own writing, both fiction and nonfiction, to define him. Some have used flawed works of previous writers and have continued an inaccurate, incomplete depiction of Jack London. In regard to alcohol, all writers have used Jack London's book, John Barleycorn, to depict his bouts with alcohol. The period of the heaviest drinking, according to London, was when he was 15 years old, during his experiences as an oyster pirate. He tried to fit in with the other oyster pirates who were all heavy drinkers. The writer who wrote the most sensational accounts of Jack London's life was Irving Stone, who published Sailor on Horseback in 1938, and did not provide any documentation in what was supposed to be a biography. Other biographers who have followed the same pattern of making assumptions were Richard O'Connor and Andrew Sinclair. The most useful source of Jack's drinking is Charmian London's diaries, where we can pinpoint a few periods during her life with Jack where she was fearful not only of drinking, but also of his chain smoking. The important point to make is that it is not really important to prove that he was an alcoholic or not an alcoholic, because that's been the debate going on for as long as I've been a docent. That's not the important point. The important point is to acknowledge Jack London's accomplishments, not only in writing, but also in sailing, adventure, and agriculture on his beauty ranch. Was he a womanizer? Through the years, he's been characterized that way. Collecting data to prove this label seems almost impossible. A review of his romantic life gives us some insight. When Jack married Bessie in 1900, it was immediately after feeling rejected by Anna Strunsky. Without a real love for Bessie, he had an affair while he was first married, he had an affair with Blanche Partington. She was a reporter and columnist. The affair continued even after his marriage, even after he left his marriage and started a true love affair with Charmian Kittredge. Charmian had not wanted to be involved in the gossip that developed after Jack's separation from Bessie, so she left the area for months at a time. Jack wrote many letters to Charmian expressing his loneliness during those separations from her. He found solace in Blanche. When Jack ended his affair with Blanche, Charmian welcomed her in a friendship that continued even after Jack died. There is some evidence that Jack was unfaithful during one of his last visits to Hawaii. The evidence is in the form of photographs passed down to a woman's granddaughter showing Jack in a pose with a young woman. London's servant at that time was Sakine, his last servant. He made an interview in the 1930s and recounted an occurrence after Jack had sent Charmian out for a swim. One day, quote, "One day we were at Waikiki Beach. He had a young lady. I don't know where he found her." End quote. The woman came to Jack's bungalow. Sakina said, quote, "The minute the girl entered the house, London asked me to gather all the chairs, even the chair from my room, and piled all the chairs against the front and back doors. When Mrs. London later tried to come in, she found the chairs piled up against the screen door." End quote. Sakina also stated, she then went out to the beach. The girl went out after a couple of hours. Only this once was he a bad boy. The rest of the time, he was very fair. These are the only incidents that have some form of documentation that's I did it again. That's reliable.
There you go.
You might have to tie a knot in it. I guess if I was a stereotype Italian, I'd be going like this, and I wouldn't have to worry about my head. So, we go on with the Wolf House fire. For Jack London and Charmian Kittredge, the concept of having their own home began when they were married. They needed some property for a building site and found the 128-acre Hill Ranch in Glen Ellen to be perfect. It was a beautiful piece of land which they purchased in June of 1905. Jack was now thinking big with his newfound celebrity. The Wolf House was to be a massive 15,000 square foot architectural beauty. Some early planning on the Wolf House was done, but it was interrupted when Jack and Charmian decided they wanted to have the adventure of sailing around the world, as Joshua Slocum had accomplished in 1898 on the boat, the Spray. The building site for the Wolf House would be prepared and would be ready for construction upon their return. After ending the Snark voyage, that was when they made their slow way home. When they got home, Jack purchased the 700-acre Kohler and Froling Ranch, and on May 1911, he was able to purchase the 12 acres in the middle of the Kohler and Froling Ranch that contained the Kohler and Froling stone winery buildings and the cottage. So if you've been to the park, all those stone buildings and the cottage were on the Kohler and Froling Ranch at one time. One of the early, most successful wineries and probably the largest in California of the time in the late 1800s. With the old cottage now his, Jack decided that he and Charmian would live in the cottage for a couple of years until the Wolf House was completed. But on August 22nd, 1913, the ultimate tragedy occurred. The Wolf House burned down. Jack and Charmian's beautiful dream house was lost, never to rise again. They were within weeks of moving in. Most thought the fire was arson. Jack thought a socialist had started the blaze because he was upset that he was building a castle that was counter to the socialist cause. Other theories emerged. Charmian had set the blaze. A fired worker had done it. Eliza's estranged husband was to blame, and that Jack had burned down his own house. Not many believe Natali Forney, the construction foreman, who correctly blamed it on spontaneous combustion and felt himself to blame for not inspecting the house at the end of the day. In 1995, I wanted to show you a good picture of the Wolf House before the tragedy. I'll hang on to it this time.
Yeah,
It's
you're
okay.
Getting it down.
I'm getting it. Okay, so a forensics fire team in 1995, including 11 engineers and investigators, completed a full-scale, several-day investigation pro bono of the Wolf House fire. The team was headed by Dr. Robert Anderson, president of RNA Consulting Incorporated, a forensic engineering consulting firm that specialized in material engineering and sciences. The team found pieces of charred wood timbers in the notch masonry pockets where beams had connected to stone walls. The timbers in the dining room were burnt more severely than in the other rooms. With these clues, the dining room seemed to be the area of fire origin. The remaining timbers in the pockets in the adjacent living room were canted and showed signs they had fallen first by the force of the tile roof falling down and then charred by the fire. The dining room had the only fireplace finished with wood in the house. This is significant because workmen were applying finishing oils to all the wood on the day of the fire. That day had been a hot day and the temperature rising over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The workers had left piles of oil-soaked rags on the dining room floor in the area of the house that contained the most amount of woodwork. Also, the windows in the dining room had not yet been installed, so it was open to the outdoors of 100-degree weather. The forensics fire team came to the conclusion that spontaneous combustion had been the most probable cause of the fire. Now to the last and probably the most controversial, Jack London's death. Ever since the death of Jack London on November 22, 1916, there have been a few writers who have written that Jack London killed himself. The person most responsible for spreading this myth around the world was Irving Stone in his supposed biography of Jack London, published in 1938, titled Sailor on Horseback. This was the title Jack London had chosen for an autobiography, which he was never to write. Stone, in his book, asserted that Jack London had died of an overdose of morphine deliberately taken. However, Stone provided no documentation for this or anything else in his book. He also plagiarized some of London's fiction, word for word, in depicting Jack London's life in this supposed biography. At least 2 other writers believed Stone's account of London's death and used his supposed evidence, thus keeping the suicide theory alive. Jack London's daughter, Joan, never believed her dad had committed suicide. This was apparent in a letter that Joan wrote to Earl Labor, the foremost Jack London scholar, about a year before her death in 1971. The letter was in support of Labor's published open letter to Irving Stone, where Labor had publicly confronted Stone with his lack of any evidence regarding suicide. More recent medical studies based on true research have concluded that Jack London's death was a result of kidney failure, exactly what London's doctor had written on the death certificate. The kidney failure, according to modern doctors, was due to several contributing factors. The most important one was mercury that was in London's system, dating back to 1908, when London was self-treating open sores in the Solomon Islands that had been caused by a bacterial spirochete infection called yaws. According to London, it caused open sores that would grow to the diameter of bigger than a silver dollar. The mercury would have gone into Jack London's bloodstream to mostly settle in the kidneys. There were no antibiotics then, so metallic poisons were mostly used. Other factors were heavy smoking, alcohol, and a protein-rich diet causing gout. Cardiovascular and cardiopulmonary disease would have evolved. Another factor yet to be studied would be lead, which was in the water pipes of the time. Lead can be dangerous to the kidneys. Jack London did use morphine to alleviate intense pain. The worst was caused by kidney stones. With his kidneys failing, even a normal dose of morphine could have proved toxic with his reduced ability to metabolize it. So with all these factors considered, it would seem that Jack London didn't have a chance and was fortunate to last his 40 years and 10 months. If you're interested in a more detailed account of what I presented, you can look on the Jack London website, jacklondonpark.com, and click on About Jack London, and then navigate on that page to find the death of Jack London, fact and fiction. But anyway, you can contact the park if you can't find it. This is a picture of Jack showing the ruins. I'm just about finished. Showing the ruins of the Wolf House to a friend of his named Ed Morrell. Ed Morrell had been a convict at San Quentin, and he had been subjected to a straitjacket in total darkness in solitary confinement for days at a time. Jack London used his story of that experience in order to produce a science fiction book called, The Star Rover. And in The Star Rover, it's a story about reincarnation and time travel. So for some people, it would be interesting. I do want to thank you for coming here and not succumbing to the Warriors game. I had to do the same thing. Now, there I wanted to show you a picture of Jack in happier times. This is on his last sailboat, the Roamer, with Charmian and with a good friend from Australia, a pianist named Laurie Smith. And the last one is the most famous picture of Jack London, which maybe all of you have seen. You can't miss it. It's been around for a long time. This picture, by the way, was taken by Charmian with a $2 box camera. So anyway, that's the end of my talk, and we can go into.
So we're running a little late, but we have time for a few questions. Any questions? Yes.
Terrific talk, and thank you for tying it into Mill Valley. It was a terrific talk, and thank you for tying it into Mill Valley. I did not realize his mother was involved in the occult and spiritualism, and I'm just wondering whether there's any evidence that those ideas and practices affected Jack, or did did any of that carry forward in his life or into his writing?
Yes, it did affect Jack in some ways, but not the way you think. Jack, I'll give you an example. He was walking home with a school friend, and they got to their house, and they heard this moaning and screaming from inside the house, and Jack said, she's just holding a seance. She was a spiritualist, and she used to assume the role of an Indian and speak in a different language, supposedly. Jack himself was not religious, if you think of it in organized religion, and he had no idea. He didn't think that there was going to be a life after death. However, it didn't stop him from saying one time to Charmian, you know, if there is something after death, if I ever came back, I think the first thing that I'd want to see is your beautiful face. And he showed hints of his inner spiritualism in many other ways, mostly with his love of humanity. He was tremendously gregarious. He reached out to everybody he encountered all the time. He was the type of person who nowadays would have to be guarded because they would be mobbed all around him, and he enjoyed that. And he loved meeting new people. He loved hearing people's stories of their life. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Didn't he have another daughter who lived to a ripe old age?
She was in her 80s. You heard that because you were on the mic, so I don't have to repeat it. She was in her 80s, and she died actually in Glen Ellen. For those of you who might have been there and remember, there was a Jack London bookstore at the bottom of the hill before you go up Jack London Road to get to the park. And the Kingmans owned the bookstore. Excuse me. Russ and Winnie Kingman owned the bookstore, and they invited Winnie to come to live there at their quarters, but they didn't have enough space. So Becky put out the money to have an addition built onto the bookstore, which is still there. The addition is still there, and that's where she moved in, and that's where she lived until she died. She would make regular visits up to the park and mingle with people and astound people when she told them who she was. She had been living prior to that time in Pleasant Hill, California, in the East Bay, and I didn't find that out until I was already living up here and Becky was long gone, because I happened to be working for the Mount Diablo School District at the time she was living there. But of course, at that time, Jack London probably was the farthest thing on my mind when I was concentrating on my special ed work, working with visually handicapped people. So anyway, Becky did, and she did present stories about her dad at the park, and she also would talk at schools. And she had talked in the Mount Diablo School District at some of the schools there. She, unlike Joan, did not turn out to be bitter regarding losing Daddy. She took it in stride, and she was very philosophical about the whole thing all the way through her whole life. So she was kind of a happy individual. Anybody else?
I have a question too. Does we have one?
Just a minute.
I find it interesting that like they judged him by the work he's written, especially as kind of an aspiring writer, because like half the stuff I've written, if they judged it based on that, I'd be locked up.
There's part of the inflections that I have a hard time understanding. Could you repeat that for me?
She was just making a comment about the controversy of the writing process, I think.
About
Correct? It's okay.
About the writing process.
Yes.
Okay.
So I have a question for you.
All right.
So I saw online that some people say that there's hauntings at the park.
That what?
Have there ever been any ghosts at the Jack London State Historic Park that you know of?
You want me to really tell them about that?
Do you want to hear?
Of course.
I had one of the experiences. When I became a docent, I had been a docent for about a year and a half and was working in the Jack London cottage. At that time, there was no furniture in the cottage. It was an empty building. And my job was to go around room to room and tell people Jack London history and what the rooms were used for, and Jack's life when he was living on the ranch. One of those days I showed up, opened up the cottage, went inside. It was a cold winter day. There was no heat. I turned on the furnace, but it didn't work. And so I went to the warmest room in the house, which was the Jack London study area, the long room above his later addition. I stood there waiting for somebody to open one of the doors and come in. While I was waiting, I started to notice that my face was feeling colder, and it continued to get colder and colder and colder. And along with the cold was added pressure. All of a sudden, I started feeling pushing against my face with extremely ice-cold air. And I thought, this is not normal. So I jumped back about 3 feet, and it didn't leave me. It stayed on my face. And I thought, well, I guess this is the time for me to explain what I'm doing in this house. So I did. And I told him about my work as a docent. And then I finally got to saying, I feel that my biggest goal in the park is to tell visitors about all the positive accomplishments in Jack's life. And as soon as I had said those words, it went, disappeared into nothing. And I stood there for the longest time until somebody woke me up from that dream and opened up the door, and I had to go to work and start telling people about Jack London history, which I went ahead and did. And then I didn't tell anybody about that experience because I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't think I did. And then finally I got up the nerve to tell Milo. And so I told him many years after I'd known him. And he started laughing. I said, "What's the matter, Milo? You don't believe me?" And he said, "Sure, I believe you." He said, "There are other people that have encountered ghosts in the cottage, and my brother Jack never wanted to live in that house because of ghosts." So I said, "Milo, did you ever encounter a ghost?" He said, "No, not me." He did live in the cottage. What I've gathered in talking to a lot of people through the years since I've had that experience who have experienced some kind of ghost experience. See, I didn't have an image that I saw. Other people have had some image, but also they've had different cold experiences, like the entire room got cold. And I didn't have that type of experience. There was another docent who was working there with the archiving some of the artifacts, and she said that in the middle of taking notes, there was a loud noise against the wall next to where she was working, and something had bounced off the wall. She looked down, and there was a big paperclip down there, and she turned around, and there was nobody around at all. And so she said, I just said, well, Jack, stop that. I'm just trying to help. And she said everything was fine. Okay, so, that's the other ghost experiences are things like one of Milo's sons went into to his cousins who was there in that house and thought that she was in the shower because he heard the shower going. And he waited for a long, long time and nobody came out and no more sound. So he finally knocked, went in the room where the bathroom shower was. No one was in there and the shower was dry.
Wow.
So anyway,
Baby Jack
shall we
believes in
close
an
up?
afterlife now. I think that was good. Thank you so much, Lou. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for bringing him to life for us tonight.
I try to do that.
You really